My name is Rodri Mogford, and I'm the Senior Publisher for History in Bloomsbury Publishing's Academic Division. I'd like to welcome you to what I have no doubt will be an absorbing and informative discussion about a cultural history of race. Bloomsbury's unparalleled 6-volume examination of the subject, which spans 2,500 years and brings together an international cast of 61 scholars. The set provides an in-depth exploration of the history of race in cultural, environmental, political, religious and scientific contexts, as well as considering definitions and representations over time, race's relationship with gender, ethnicity and the body, and analysis of anti-race. As well as receiving an extremely positive review in the Ethnic and Racial Studies Journal, we're very proud to highlight that A Cultural History of Race has garnered the glowing support and enthusiasm of a host of world-renowned experts in the field, with Priyamvada Gopal recognising it as an important contribution to the historical literacy that is needed if we're to challenge race and racism effectively, and Angela Saini championing it as admirably ambitious, clarifying and comprehensive, and truly outstanding. Very shortly, we'll be fortunate enough to hear from the general editor and editors from 5 of the 6 volumes who are able to kindly share their thoughts about the set and its place in the field both now and in the future. Before I introduce them, I'd like to mention a few minor items regarding the webinar and the format to ensure everyone has the information they need and the session runs smoothly. Firstly, I'm delighted to confirm that everyone who is registered for today's event can benefit from a 20% discount off the retail price of A Cultural History of Race using the GLR9VS promotional code that I will put in the webinar chat a little later on. We're also going to be conducting a random computer-generated raffle next week for one registered event attendee to win a free 6-volume set. All attendees will be notified on email when we have a winner, with the info about the event discount also being recirculated for everyone's convenience. The general editor and the volume editors will each be taking the opportunity to share their thoughts and experiences, and this is likely to take up the majority of our time in today's webinar. That said, if you have a question for an individual editor or the collective editor team, please add it to the chat and I'll look to put questions to our speakers at the end if we have time. Turning then to the speakers who are so generously giving up their time and who it's my privilege to now introduce. Marius Turda, who you will hear from first, is Professor in Central and Eastern European Biomedicine at Oxford Brookes University in the UK. And as well as being the author and editor of several fascinating books in this and related fields, has been the inimitable driving force and general editor for the Cultural History of Race set. It's a pleasure to introduce Thomas Hahn, the editor of our Middle Ages volume and a professor in the English department at the University of Rochester in the US. We're very lucky to have Kimberley Coles, an associate professor of English at the University of Maryland, and Dorothy Kim, an assistant professor of English at Brandeis University, with us to talk about their experiences editing the Renaissance and Early Modern Age volume. Professor Nicholas Hudson of the University of British Columbia in Canada is thankfully here to give us his insights on how race takes shape in the Reformation and Enlightenment periods. We're also fortunate to be able to hear from Marina Mogilner, who holds the Edward and Mariana Thaden Chair in Russian and East European Intellectual History at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and Tanya Golash-Boza, the founder of the Racism, Capitalism and the Law Lab, and a professor of sociology at the University of California, Merced. Who will be talking us through their respective experiences as editors of the Empire and the Nation State and Modern and Genomic Age volumes. Welcome, and thanks once again to you all for joining us today. And without further ado, please allow me to hand over to Marius so he can share his opening thoughts.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Rodri. It's a real pleasure to be here. I ought to say I was very trepidant about the whole enterprise because we belong to so many different time zones, and I thought it would be quite difficult to bring everyone together. And we almost succeeded. Regrettably, one editor is not able to join us, Denise, editor of Volume 1, who's traveling at the moment, but with a bit of luck, she will be joining us later. And of course, we very much hope that Dorothy Kim will be joining us a bit later as well. So having said that, I ought to start by saying simply, I thought this was the most daunting thing I've done in my life. I was absolutely scared from the day one this project was proposed to me. I remember sitting in a coffee shop 5 years ago in Bloomsbury in London, and I met one of your editors at Bloomsbury, and we were having coffee and chatting about what's happening in the world. So this is 2017, early 2017. So Brexit had happened, Trump was elected in America, so massive political earthquakes. So we felt that something needs to be done, but I couldn't quite think that there would be a project on the history of race and racism of this scale. So as a modern historian, of course, I was familiar with a wealth of literature that existed, particularly on the 19th, 20th centuries. And I was like, it would be very difficult to actually put something together. But in the end, it did happen. And I was extremely fortunate to work with a stellar group of scholars, an absolutely amazing list of contributors and editors from where I've learned a great deal. And not only in terms of scholarship, but in terms of human sensitivity to certain issues, in terms of cultural affinities. And it was really a humbling experience. But this project, because I mentioned Trump and Brexit and other political events, this was way before, of course, the pandemic, was way before George Floyd's murder and Black Lives Matters and the upheavals that followed. But this was not a project that emerged from disappointment with existing political landscape, although, of course, we had the feeling, particularly in Britain, that things are going down the drain. We proved to be absolutely correct in that assessment, I suppose. But we were, animated, if I can put it this way, by a desire to really question the validity and vulnerability of a certain set of assumptions about race. Its chronology. I mentioned I'm a modern historian, so obviously I knew very little about things that happened in early modern periods in antiquity. So, and people normally would associate race with. So what are you talking about when you say race in classical antiquity? What do you mean by it? What do you say it means when you are referring to race in Renaissance or early modern periods, or of course in parts of the world which don't have a traditionally complex or sophisticated scholarship on race? And sort of these assumptions, I thought, need to be revised and reworked. So chronology, the polymorphic nature of race needed to be questioned, because of course, we knew how it works and how it impacts our daily lives and how it still guides the scholarship being produced on both sides of the Atlantic and more globally. But it's very hard to put it all together. So this was how it all started. And then I thought, okay, I'll give it a go. I'm going to contact a few people and see whether we could get a project going. Meanwhile, I started thinking, of course, about how one of the most pernicious and persistent ideas in Western history is belief in racial categories that mark groups of people as physically and intellectually distinct. And it bears repetition. It's almost a truism, but I think it's important to emphasize this. Race is one of the foundational stones upon which rests an impressive cultural and political edifice. That has, alas, I think, endured until the 21st century. We could still see the edifice may have crumbled in parts. It's got cracks in the walls. It lost a few floors, but the building still stands. The building that race and racism built is still there. We're still engaging with that. We're still going through its rooms. We're still finding a way out of it. It's very labyrinthic and it's like a maze, and that remains to be unpacked and discussed. Now, of course, I also want to say from the outset, and this is what I discussed with the publisher, that we shouldn't have this idea that race, of course, it was always accepted and it was always considered to be a given. It was, if we look at history, and we'll hear from the editors, often it was met with suspicion, it was reinterpreted, it was rejected, both in the past, or the distant past, if we think of antiquity or medieval times or early modern periods, and of course in the 19th, 20th century. So we have what we called in the volume an anti-race thinking occurring in numerous places, in various intellectual activities and disciplines. Of course, we know the examples coming from religion and science, which are very important, and they're very well illustrated in these volumes. So race, and I'm sure my colleagues would discuss this a bit more than I can now do in my short presentation. Race defined biologically, culturally, or linguistically, or religiously, is embedded in the Western white culture. And its core myths and values and ideas and norms. So it shaped basically not just assumptions about white culture superiority, but also global capitalism, of course, slavery, and very importantly, and this is an element that is clearly evidenced in these volumes, very importantly, what I can call a patriarchal Christian morality. And there is very good literature now on the relation between race and religion, and particularly Christian thinking and religion. So what we're trying to do, and this is something I negotiated and discussed with the editors, was that we cannot decouple the concept of race, historically speaking, from the very idioms that have been used throughout history to describe and classify humans. Nor can it be expunged or excised from projects of domination and subjugation and oppression. In other words, we don't want to always talk about race in a very intellectual and academic way and not consider the actual victims, the actual people who are at the other end of this intellectual project. So the oppressive nature of it has to be clearly stated. And these are projects then and now motivated politically. As we know, we could see this happening continuously. They are state sanctioned, particularly after the birth of modern nation states. And very sadly, of course, and scientists and religious figures are adamantly rejecting this, but they often been blessed by scholars and scientists. A host of scientists endorsed race and race thinking and eugenics, and we know that. And some of them continue to do so. So how can we capture, something as elastic as race as a concept? How can we travel across time and space, historical periods, and geographical locations? So that was something that I was very keen to get across. And luckily, the editors were able to pull in some fantastic contributions to show that diversity, because ultimately we wanted to cut across this multi-layered fabric of culture and science and politics. Also, I think it's important, and hopefully we'll have time after the presentations to talk about not just the long history of race, but also, and references to past events, of course, which the volumes clearly demonstrate and illustrate that actually we need to see race, how it functions, how it builds, how it constructs. We know that race is a construct, but we also know that race constructs. It constructs realities. And we need to understand this sort of the current systemic racism that remains so evident and so powerful. So the dialogue I had with the editors, and once we finalized the list, which had proven to be a bit complicated. As you can imagine, we're talking about 6 editors, 7, and about 60 contributors. So it's a small army of people here that we assembled to get this project completed, to carry on with our ideas. And it was extraordinary in many ways. So, but what we all agreed, I think, although we disagreed on many levels and we disagreed on various aspects, and I was, as I said at the beginning, I was always in the position of receiving advice and guidance from them, because they are they're established scholars in their own fields, and everyone should learn from them. But we all agreed, as I said, that this should be an attractive and fruitful and provocative critical project to enable broader audiences, not just specialists. Ultimately, the series, as we spoke about at Bloomsbury, was to open this up to undergraduates and students and people who are not necessarily specialists. So we want to open up and to make them think about the full implications of living in historically racialized societies. We live in these societies in Britain, in the US, and North America, and other parts of the world, Brazil. These are racialized society and the racial societies. So we wanted, and you'll hear more from my colleagues, we wanted to confront these long intertwined legacies of racism, objectification, and dehumanization of various groups and individuals based on the color of their skin, of course, but also on their geographical origin, on their religious beliefs, or indeed their gender. So there is a lot about ableism and sexism and classism in connection to racism. So in other words, we wanted to see how race works with gender, religion, and class, and nation, other adjacent concepts, and how they shaped human history. And this is how the chapters are more or less organized. So recognizing the historical legacies of race not only, I hope, explains how the current racial order came to be, but reveals its ongoing personification in the present. And we shouldn't forget the present ultimately is what wants to be discussed, I suppose, forcefully by many of us here. How can we still navigate these complex realities? And of course, this is what we're going to hear from the editors in a bit. I think we need to look at this work as a collective work, and I think this is why it's one of the important. Everyone worked very well individually, but I think they worked amazingly in a team. And if you look at each volume separately and together, of course, but look at them separately, you understand the tremendous amount of work and energy and creativity that's gone into it. So I think, and I say this not because I was the general editor, and of course I was privileged to read every single chapter in various forms and various versions of it and discuss with the editors and with some of the contributors directly. But I think it does offer some academic guidance, and also, very importantly, a nuanced and innovative critique of race and racism. So they are informed by research and academic reflection, but at the same time, and I think this became very clear after George Floyd's murder in 2020, that is about the lived experience of many of the authors and contributors to these volumes. So some of the things had to be reshaped and tweaked in order to illustrate that critical engagement with the history of race, but also with the toxicity of ideology of racism that continues to affect our world. So I don't want to take too much time because the whole plan is to have a conversation and to listen to the editors, but I do very much hope that at the end we'll have a moment to reflect more about what we could do now and how we can look forward, and then see whether we could get some questions from the audience and then wrap this up in a very nicely and constructive way. So without further ado, I should like to turn my attention to Tom, the editor of Volume 2, Cultural History of Race in the Middle Ages. And the floor is yours, Tom.
Thank you, Marius. Is my mic on? Yes, good. Okay, so Marius has just given us a kind of history of the origins of the project, and I have to say that from the outset, I've felt both admiration and a little alarm at Marius's ambition in bringing some 60-something scholars together to produce an account of race from antiquity to the present in the West. Over the course of the project, I've come to see that the many voices that are highlighted in this cultural history of race, and in particular the volume on the Middle Ages, which I'm most familiar with, have actually produced a more insistent, engaging, informed, and comprehensive account than any single scholar could possibly have achieved. Our volume, the Middle Ages volume, contains work by scholars who have been trained, who have taught in France, the Netherlands, Austria, Singapore, the UK, Canada, and the US, working from distinctive perspectives and from a variety of disciplines. Ultimately, its purpose and its achievement, I think, or hope, is not to sum up and conclude urgent conversations about race, but rather to extend and to excite further conversations and explorations on how we uncover and understand race-making and race thinking in contexts that are 500 or 1500 years removed from our own experience. For medievalists, the volume appears at an opportune moment. The Geraldine Heng's publication in 2018 of The Invention of Race in the Middle Ages signaled the legitimacy and the centrality of pre-modern critical race studies, and offered a provocation to engage new archives and new disciplinary models. Jerry's structural articulation, which she repeats in her essay for the volume, of the divergent shapes of medieval race and the ways in which it might be studied has been widely quoted and reproduced. She says, race making operates as specific historical occasions in which strategic essentialisms are positive and assigned through a variety of practices and pressures, so as to construct a hierarchy of peoples for differential treatment. My understanding, thus, is that race is a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences, rather than a substantive content. And I think that most of the essays, or all of the essays for that matter, in the volume on the Middle Ages actually follow that structural definition that Jerry has just offered. I'm going to kind of move on then from 2018 to Cord Whitaker's Black Metaphors, How Modern Racism Emerged from Medieval Race Thinking, which appeared the following year, 2019. In that volume and in an earlier articulation and in his essay for the Bloomsbury history, Cord actually affirms the kind of existence of medieval race thinking and race making. He says, yes, in response to the question of does race really exist in the Middle Ages? Yes, the Middle Ages have been thoroughly raced. The question at hand is exactly how are they raced? Not whether, but how is medieval race thinking different from modern racism? How does it contribute to the formation of modern racism? What can we decipher of the intellectual, cultural, psychological, and even emotional dynamics that give rise to race thinking in the Middle Ages? In short, how does medieval race work from the inside out? And I think that the 10 essays in the collection really address this question repeatedly and thoroughly. And I'd like to actually sort of maybe take a look quickly or just summarize at least some of the perspectives that the volume offers. Because there are a kind of rich variety of understandings and responses to these questions. The essays address canonical events and texts from established and inventive perspectives, repeatedly querying the assumptions of both established and groundbreaking research. The final essay in the volume, Anti-Race, is by William Chester Jordan and Helmut Reimitz, and they attempt with some skepticism, it seems to me, as they say, to make plain how geographically diverse, long emerging and complex, and despite all their differences, how intertwined the scholarly genealogies still are. And so I think there's a sense, in other words, from their perspective as both historians, that there's a way in which we need to kind of understand the particularity of the different formations of medieval race rather than simply posit it existing as a totality. And they say, for example, at the very end of the essay, in other words, how can we study race thinking, borrowing therefore from Hahn and Whitaker, how can we study race thinking as a historically situated yet open-ended process distinct from other forms of categorization? So I think that there's a kind of wariness in this essay about the kind of possibility of formulating how we understand medieval race, given how far distant we are and how much evidence there is that we continuously find anew. And I guess I want to go back to the kind of first essay in the volume proper after the introduction, Chris Chisholm's definitions and representations of race, and suggest that she offers both a kind of opposite and complementary perspective to Jordan and Reimitz. She says at the very end of her introductory paragraphs and so on, I want to argue that pre-modern racing is best seen as a gambit, a bad faith negotiation, whose unexpected turns can at once violate its victims and its perpetrators. So it seems to me that there's this is exactly the kind of formulation that Jordan and Reimitz are kind of wondering about, and it seems to me that Chris's response to this is actually to kind of open the sort of issues that Jordan and Reimitz have presented us with. And I guess I'd like to spend the rest of my allotted time here just saying a few words about some of the other essays in the volume. I think in terms of the different kinds of race that the Middle Ages produced, Maaike van der Lugt's essay, which is on race and science, just provides a remarkable welter of evidence demonstrating the remarkably extensive and diverse ways in which medieval medicine and medieval natural philosophy systematically engaged issues of racial identity. And that seems to me to be a really kind of just a treasure trove that didn't exist in English until she published that essay. Steve Kruger actually wrote a book about the so-called, what he called the category of the spectral Jew, this kind of character who is invoked without actually being present and so on. And I think his essay on sexualization and race in the volume is really does a remarkable job of using that category and comparing it to what he calls generalized Muslims and others who continue to exemplify the traits assigned to a race by those who've excluded the people described from their own communities. David Nierenberg, on his essay on race and religion, I think does a similar kind of thing, exploring the kind of sense, in other words, in which converted Jews especially wind up actually not being taken to be members of the community, but wind up actually having a kind of a new and separate identity. And he concludes by saying that we're just, it's so difficult to actually reconcile these kind of different categories. And then finally, I want to mention Sarah Salih's kind of really wonderful kind of twist in which, in retelling the saint's life of Thomas Becket, she manages to actually engage it with the kind of fairly widespread fantasy in the Middle Ages of the Muslim princess's marriage through love and therefore through conversion. And she puts this in the context of a saint's life and shows how wildly popular it was actually, across the Middle Ages. So that again, we get the sense of how to kind of create a context for reception that challenges our assumptions about how these things work. And then finally, this is not too self-aggrandizing, I'd like to actually sort of go back to just one example that I've used in my essay about the chronicle of, the Latin chronicle of Albert of Aachen, which was written in the early 12th century. And Albert actually talks about this episode that is reported nowhere else, in which Baldwin of Jerusalem kind of traps and then executes a community of some 400 so-called Ascoparts, all of whom are repeatedly described by skin color, especially in terms of their extreme blackness and so on. And the thing that really strikes me about this, and which I've tried, therefore, to connect it to Isabel Wilkerson's notions of caste, is the kind of mindset in terms of racialization and race thinking that it offers. Because obviously, occurring as it does in a Latin chronicle that is addressed to educated groups in Western Europe who have no connection whatsoever to Jerusalem, the only way in which this story makes sense is if indeed the audience is already prepared to understand racial categories. And so therefore, by kind of running the story by his readers and expecting them to actually understand what Baldwin's kind of attempt at shock and awe in Jerusalem was all about, he's obviously making clear that there's a kind of shared understanding of how race operates and how it confers identities or takes them away. So I hope that this gives you some sense of where the volume goes and what it contains, and of how it fits into the series. And I'm happy to answer questions if there's time at the end, as Marius says. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tom. Brilliant. And now we move swiftly to Kim, who will talk about Volume 3, which dealt with the Renaissance and the early modern age. The floor is yours, Kim.
In fact, we were asked to talk about the experience of editing the volume, and I'm afraid I took that charge very seriously. So my remarks will be more personal, I think. I'm going to limit them to 5 minutes because we'll be joined by my co-editor, Dorothy Kim, later in the session. For my part, editing any collection is a learning experience. I edit collections for the experience, but I think I've learned the most from this one. It's in part because of the groundbreaking work that's contained in our volume. Chapters by M.W. McCoskey, Joseph Hefner, Geraldine Hang, Kathy Levezzo, Asa Mittman, Adam Miyashiro, Rebecca Redfern, Michelle Sewer, Robert Sturgis, Matthew Vernon, and of course, Dorothy herself, shows the productive use of critical race theory in the examination of cultural history. We outline our commitments in the introduction to the volume. The issue of excavating the past, foundational methodologies, and how the past is always an interpretive act from the lens of the present, with its theories, technologies, more nuanced ways of excavation, is a consistent thread in this volume. The methodology applied throughout the chapters is pre-modern critical race studies, a phrase that was coined by Margot Hendricks. Racism is intrinsic to the literary and cultural practices that we teach in the late medieval and early modern periods. It's the history embedded in the artifacts themselves. Each chapter attempts to isolate an element of the various constituent practices of the pre-modern critical race, or of the pre-modern race concept. But pre-modern critical race studies assumes that strategies of racial construction are inevitably fitted to economic agendas. This assumes that the strategies are repurposed at different sites, different times, with different agendas. But it also assumes that the objective is consistently social and economic power. What changes over time are the targets. Race isn't teleological, but it's fundamentally transhistorical. The volume follows the schema of the entire Bloomsbury Cultural History of Race series that include 9 chapters on specified prescribed topics. Within these frames, the various chapter writers have taken up the task to push the discussion forward, and particularly to have a transhistorical discussion, as is the setup of the series, with especially contemporary critical race theory and new areas of critical race inquiry that we hope is legible to scholars who work in various pasts, current presents, and useful to those who are thinking about the future. But in positing that future, and here it's imagined as an academic future that we hope has consequences for a cultural one, I want to address a structural problem within the volume collection itself. Why are we all white scholars? This is not a call out. I didn't ask this question when I was invited to edit a volume in 2017. And I'm obviously taking this particular moment when only white editors are in the discussion to ask the question. Because the more important lesson that I learned in this experience is about editing itself and the questions that we need to ask if we're stepping into the role as white scholars. True, editing doesn't contribute greatly to promotion or compensation. And so I thought this was meaningful political work, particularly for a senior scholar. But I didn't consider what the presence of my name on the cover or my collaboration in deciding who was chosen to contribute to it meant. I didn't refuse and insist that a BIPOC scholar should be asked instead. Collaboration with Dorothy made our volume infinitely better than it would have been had I attempted the work on my own. There is diverse collaboration among the contributors to the volumes in the collection. There's certainly diversity in the audience for the collection. But our presence here as a roster of all white editors mutely makes the point. The centering of white scholars as gatekeepers in the field of critical race studies across period is deeply problematic. Allyship changes with developments in our respective fields, and the politics requisite to a political moment shift. But thinking about a future in critical race studies, I want to ask how we can be truly political in it now. The perspective of these projects should not be shaped by white scholars. I'm certainly not suggesting that white scholars be abolished from fields that employ critical race studies. And I certainly am suggesting that we need to be attentive to the racial formation of whiteness. But if we're going to render the operations of whiteness visible within our critical work, we need to be as attentive of these operations outside of it. And if we want to be truly political, we need to ask ourselves if we're the right person for a project, if our collaboration makes it better. Not how we as white scholars can create venues in which to place this work, but how we as white scholars do the necessary work of removing ourselves and getting out of the way. If the political now is a necessary adjunct to our research of the past, this has to be not just in topic, but in structure. The experience of editing this volume will prompt me in future to ask more questions about my own complicity in the structural problems of the field in which I work. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim, for bringing this up. A very important issue, something that we struggle from the outset. And in all, not to say face, as it were, but in all honesty, I should like to say that the first list of editors I put forward were all people of scholars of color. Regrettably, I could not persuade any of them to be the editor. So I had two options: either give up or at least hope that the editors in turn would make a very good selections of their contributors, not only in terms of color, but also in terms of gender. So not only straight scholar, but also queer scholars and so on and so forth. So whilst I lived with that feeling of insufficient and somehow deficiency, I still believe that whilst I was totally on board with everything you said, that project could still be pushed forward whilst accepting all the structural problems that raise from us being white scholars. And finally, I come from Eastern Europe, and my family's origins, in a way, allow me, my whiteness has been questioned historically on numerous of occasions, comparing to, say, someone who's an English origin or a German origin. So whilst I am considered by people as a white scholar, I do think I come from a tradition that at least enables me to understand and question whiteness in a way that is not similar to someone who's Black or Asian, but it's similar to someone who was born in Eastern Europe, a region which is consistently considered a different type of white, not quite as white as the others. So with all these epistemological things going on, I thought maybe we could try at least, whilst taking on board the very important issues you raised. And I'm grateful for that you put a finger on it, Kim. Now,
I want to say, Marius, I had some trepidation because I did think it then fell on you. And I don't think it should. It falls on me as much. But I think going forward, the choices we make will address the structural problems in the field itself. And it's something I want to be much more mindful of as I move forward in the field.
I couldn't agree more, and I'm sure many of participants here would share this, or even more aggressively criticize some of the choices we made in putting this together. But this is part of the dialogue, it's part of the conversation we ought to be having. I suppose, as you rightly pointed out, white scholars should not avoid the conversation. They should be engaging with the conversation, even if it means their demise or emptying the space they occupy for so long, academically, socially, politically, and culturally. That has to happen. So I want to turn now to Volume 4 and to Nick Hudson, who will say a few words about his experience as editor and how he saw that volume shaping up.
Okay, can you hear me? Yeah. Good morning, everybody, as it's still morning here in Vancouver. I'm very glad to be here and to be given the chance to have done this this volume. I guess the most wonderful thing about my experience, I guess, was being in collaboration with this set of people who contributed to my volume, many of whom I knew of and admired, and in some cases had been in contact. But it really sort of opened my mind to a range of scholars from the early modern period up into the Renaissance, and that was a really wonderful part of this experience. One of our contributors, Dennis Britton, ended up being hired by my department, so he graduated from being just being a contributor to a colleague. So the whole experience for me socially was really wonderful, and I'm still actually in contact with the contributors of my volume in various kinds of ways. So that was wonderful. I guess for me, the experience, and I'm talking here about the learning experience of my volume, and I think probably all the other editors will agree with me that reading these essays carefully and receiving the essays and also searching for contributors and doing all the work as an editor was a real experience of learning, where my ideas came out at the end of the process much different than they were at the beginning. And I think the really interesting and, for me, illuminating feature of these volumes was doing race in conjunction with other fields. Now, my work has mostly been on the definition and origin of scientific race and so forth, so I knew all about that. And some of the essays by Suman Seth, for instance, and Dennis Britton were generally in areas that I already had opinions about and so forth. But other essays dealing with, for instance, the natural world and race in Jean Freilich's essay, or with race and politics in Matthew Bennett's essay, or race and gender in Karl Plass's essay, and so forth. And because of the circumstances of how things developed, I ended up writing the race and sexuality essay for my volume, because one of our contributors had to leave. And that and I had very short time to write it as well. So it was a real challenge, sort of immersing myself in issues of race and sexuality. But it was one of, I think, most interesting and formative experiences of my career. It was really, really interesting, and has affected the way I look not only on my scholarship, but also on teaching as well. What I found out about my own period, the 18th century, was how interlocked and intersecting race and sexuality actually were. Orinoco, the novel by Afra Ben, involves this sexual relationship between African and African princess. But in the subsequent dramatic versions of Afra Ben's novel by Thomas Southern and John Hawkesworth and John Ferrier, Imuinda, who is the African prince or African woman, is changed into a white woman. So that this became an extremely popular play, and Orinoco, particularly Southern's version, was extraordinarily popular. It was always performed with a black hero and a white heroine, and this is specifically a sexual relationship. She's pregnant in all the versions of it, and it's a problem really to work out, and one that scholars, I think, have not really fully broached in a way that satisfies me exactly why audiences enjoyed that relationship so much, because it was done over and over and over again. And it's not the only example in the 18th century. Besides the extraordinary popularity of Othello throughout the century, there's, as Karl Plasse wrote about in his essay, there's a very important legend in the 18th century involving the couple of Jericho and Inkel. Now, this originated from a 17th century work by Francis Legault, History of the Bermudas, but it was revived in the 18th century by Sir Richard Steele in The Spectator, a very important journal in the 18th century. And this legend of Jericho and Inkel was turned into numerous poems and plays and so forth. Again, a legend that was repeated over and over again. and involves the relationship between a white English trader, Inkel, and either an indigenous or black woman. She changes her color and her origins in various versions of it. And at the end of the story, in all the versions of it, Inkel sells Yeriko into slavery, and in most versions she's pregnant at that time. And this was considered to be, in the view of all the commentary on Yeriko and Inkel, a really terrible thing for him to do. And a great deal, she became a kind of sentimentalized hero, Yeriko, culminating in a comic opera, actually, Inkel and Yeriko, by George Coleman the Younger at the end of the century. So what do we make in the 18th century of all these versions of what was later called miscegenation, of a fascination among audiences of that time with interracial relationships at the same time that race theory of a scientific form was emerging? And these works, such as Orinoco and Yeriko and Inkel, also became tied up with the abolition, the movement, the campaign to abolish the slave trade as well. So white audiences were gaining a kind of access to appreciating or sympathizing or feeling sentiment for persons of color through these sexual relationships that were being repeatedly performed on stage and in the press. Anyways, that's my experience and what I found so fascinating. In other words, these issues of intersection. And when I looked around, I found that the issues of intersection between race and sexuality, and race and gender, and race and other fields was really important. It shaped my my teaching and research a lot, particularly my teaching. At the moment, I am teaching a graduate seminar on race and gender, and also an undergraduate class on race and gender. And because gender right now is equally with race, this very important issue, the students are incredibly stimulated right now to think about in issues of gender. These courses have been really fun and interesting, full of lively conversation and commentary. The students are very, very absorbed in understanding this interconnection this intersection that I'm interested in, which of course is also very important in current critical race theory, these kinds of intersections that we really should not be looking at any of these issues, race or gender or class, in distinction from those other categories. So the whole process for me has been very illuminating, extremely interesting, and has shaped the way I look at the issues that I'm studying for so many years. I'm now looking at them in a new way, and I'm very glad that I took this on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. Well, I'm very glad you took it on. As you pointed out, there were some difficulties along the way, but you managed to overcome everything so smoothly. I was utterly impressed. And I'm also happy you highlighted one element here, which I think is necessary to be reminded, that how much we get involved with this through our teaching. And all of us teach at universities or would like to teach at universities, and interacting with students and listening to them, it's equally rewarding, and we learn as much. I think I speak for all of you who teach. We learn so much from our students now as you would learn from other forms of learning experience we had in the past. So that's quite something that is extremely important, that you can use this volume in your class, and you could actually allow the students to engage with the text, critique them, and of course complain about some of the assumptions put forward. That's very important. This will move the conversation forward. Well, talking about moving the conversation forward, how about we move into the age of empire, the nation states? And with that in mind, it's my pleasure to invite Marina to say a few words.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? So I want to start with expressing my gratitude to Marius for inviting me as an editor of the volume on empires and nation state. This was a challenging, extremely interesting, and very meaningful in various ways experience for me. And I also want to share my admiration for all the contributors and editors of other volumes, I learned a great deal from, especially from the pre-modern volumes. I think it's a treasure trove of, new information and new debates, and thank you so much to all. So the volumes that I edited that covered the period from roughly from late 18th century to the early 20th century, that is the long 19th century, may seem from the outset at the most predictable, because race and modernity, race and empire, race and colonialism, race and the rise of the nation state idea, these are like well-established frameworks for the discussion of race. And yet I think that our volume, and I use our because this is definitely a result of collective work and collaboration. So I actually think that our volume offers a new perspective on familiar topics, and not least because it looks beyond the traditional and simplistic dichotomies such as West-East, even modernity and traditionalism, colonizer and colonized, land-based versus overseas empires, and so on. The volume takes seriously the definition of empire as a regime of differentiated governance over diverse populations, and zooms in on different contexts, regimes, and methods of constructing and reproducing difference. It questions the naturalness of the location of modernity in the West, and is instead our volume historicizes this outcome through the lens of global negotiation and co-creation of concepts such as race, civilization, progress, and also various historical temporalities. Finally, our volume deconstructs the succession from empire to nation by placing nationalizing thinking back into its original imperial context. And it debates nation is placed back in its original context, and also the debates about kinship and patriarchy and participation and exclusion are also brought back to this global and entangled imperial world of the long 19th century. The volume also combines a focus on race thinking with the analysis of race making. That is the history of discourses, history of ideologies, history of science and ideas, with, social history from below and from above. In all of this, Volume 5 resonates with other volumes in the series, and I hope it also constitutes an original, complex, and multi-layered and multi-dimensional narrative of its own. So the volume in general looks at specific imperial, colonial, nationalizing, and hybrid contexts, framing the semantics and politics of race in the course of the long 19th century, when racial epistemology and race-making were omnipresent. Many individual chapters in Volume 5 are focused on, designed as case studies, and are focused on specific contexts, and this is by design. This way, we can show not only, global, entangled, and intersectional, and like superhistorical nature of race, but also its situational nature and diverse functions that racializing performed in modernity. The series as a whole prompts us to see that race was not a modern invention. But at the same time, in the period covered in my volume, race was an almost universal epistemology. One of the most popular and scientifically legitimized languages of diversity and groupness, deployed by those who hold political power and cultural hegemony, and also controlled gender regimes, but also deployed by those who opposed, who resisted this powers and hegemonies. And so I would say that our volume approaches race as a language of the epoch, as a pervasive cultural optics, as a style of thought, to use the Saidian definition, but also as politics, as lived experience, and I want to stress this, also as a weapon of the weak. Also, I want to highlight the fact that, well, the general editor has entrusted this volume to a historian of the Russian imperial formation, which is the choice is far from obvious, given how little has been done on race in the Russian Empire, in Eastern Central Europe in general. And I think it's also significant that I include Russia and Russian Empire, Habsburg Empire, Ottoman Empire in my introductory chapter, and that these three land-based, non-Western, I'm using quotation marks here, empires are evoked in other chapters in the volume as reference points or as case studies indeed. We have one chapter in particular that is centered on the Russian Empire, and this is chapter on race and politics. It's authored by Sergei Glebov, and it explores the politics in plural of race in the Russian Far East, race as an experiential reality from below, race as a discourse of imperial authorities in St. Petersburg, but also race and the politics of race by local administration in the region. And these are all, every layer here is very specific. So the chapter on the science of race by Project Bihari Mukherjee is also somewhat unconventional in its focus on human hair as an object of race science. This very interesting chapter exposes complex interpolations between science, magic, and colonialism in this modern science, and suggests continuities between the long 19th century race science and more recent sciences of human difference. It also allows us to see how the exact science resonate with popular beliefs and with the rising admiration for technology that took upon itself the function of assessing and interpreting the hidden essence of objects, human and material. The chapter on race and religion by Marwa El-Shakri is focused on the evolving semantics of religion, civilization, and race in the discourses of Muslim modernity, which she approaches as reflective of many tensions of modern imperialism, Arab nationalism, and religious identifications. In the chapter on race and ethnicity, Richard McMahon decenters the conversation about race by incorporating in this conversation the European margins, such as the Mediterranean and Eastern Europe. Again, so McMahon suggests the concept of national races to account for the presence of race thinking in modern nationalisms. These are only few examples from the volume that also features contributions by Roland McCoskey, a historian of sciences of human diversity in empires, Lynn Hudson, who specializes in African American and women and gender history and writes about race as a space of resistance, Emily Kern, a historian of science who contributed a fascinating chapter on race, environment, language, and colonialism, by Maria Sophia Queen, an author of a sophisticated, also global and comparative chapter on race and gender, and by Myrna Peretz-Sheldon, whose chapter approaches sexuality in the long 19th century as a secular theory of race. Overall, I believe that our volume not only reiterates and summarizes and synthesizes what we have known already about race in the long 19th century, but responds to many new challenges that derive from not only contemporary politics, academic politics as well, but from the location of race at the intersection of so many discourses and practices of groupness, domination, resistance, and reform in the long 19th century. The volume also deals with the fact that by the end of the period that it covers, a proactive self-racializing manifested itself as a subaltern strategy aimed at normalizing one's own groupness in the language of the hegemonic episteme of the time. So in this sense, I hope the volume offers ways to restructure, reimagine our conversation about race and global modernity. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Marina, for this wonderful overview of the volume and the interesting aspects related to a number of issues, and particularly the fact that you mentioned Russia and obviously the entire very interesting but little known history of race in Russia or the Russian Empire. So that's obviously something that we could learn more about and get acquainted to, not least because it would probably help some of us understand a bit better what's happening at the moment in Russia. So you also mentioned science, and obviously we know now developments in human genetics, particularly in the second part of the 20th century, dismantle or is try to dismantle pretensions of respectability appropriated by scientific racism. But the current debates in genomics, I think, reveal how race, the concept, continues to impact a scientifically informed worldview. In fact, and I've read some articles published in quite prestigious journals, the completion of the Human Genome Project, for example, spurred attempts to define a concept of race that is scientifically credible. So scientists are trying to make this scientifically credible again. Right, with this very short and erratic introduction, I want to turn to volume 6, which deals with the modern genomic age, and to invite my colleague Tanya to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you. So now we're going to move into the age of PowerPoint, if we can pull that off. So today what I'm going to talk about is the evolution of the idea of race from scientific racism to genomics. All right, and looks like it's coming up. Let's take a second to load. All right, well, while it's loading, so I'm coming from the US context, and in the context of the United States, race is extremely important. So in the US, people feel the need to know what race someone is before interacting with them. And race is not only important in daily interactions, it permeates all of our institutions and is the basis of social inequality. For example, African Americans have 10% of the wealth whites have, and Black people are twice as likely to be unemployed as white people. So how do we get here? To tell the story of race in the Americas, we have to go back to at least 1492. When Christopher Columbus and his crew arrived in the Caribbean, Columbus did not think of himself as white, and he did not think of the natives as Indians. So how did these monikers emerge? And why is it that today in the US, when we encounter someone, the first thing we want to know about them is their race? And why has race become part of our worldview? Race in the United States is even institutionalized in the census, and the US government provides definitions of what it considers to be the 4 major racial groups. So why are these particular 4 groups so important? The census categorizations are also notably the exact same categorizations used by Carolus Linnaeus in 1735. So this division of the world into 4 races is based on the view of European colonizers and conquistadores. With the beginning of the Enlightenment, the divisions became kind of more scientific or pseudoscientific. And during the context of the Enlightenment is important because scientists classified all of humankind into 4 races, and they did so based on their prevailing ideologies. So Native Americans were characterized as carefree and not able to manage the land they were inhabiting. Asians were characterized as opinionated and haughty and not to be trusted in trade relations. Africans were characterized as lazy, meaning that they must be enslaved if they were to work. And Europeans, of course, characterized themselves as intelligent and superior. So the ideologies that surrounded race that developed in the 1600s and 1700s justified the exploitation of African labor and the appropriation of Native American land. These particular justifications are important because they help us to understand contemporary racial discourses about these 2 groups. So Linnaeus was one of many 18th century European thinkers who used the tools at their disposal to categorize all of humanity into 4 or 5 races. And this was part of an intellectual trend in the Enlightenment to take a universalist standpoint and to create categories that tried to explain everything. So Georges Louis Leclerc, Comte de Buffon, Carolus Linnaeus, and other Enlightenment thinkers not only characterized all humanity into races, they also assigned physical and cultural attributes to each race. These divisions were not based on anything we would characterize today as scientific. Instead, these divisions were based on these thinkers' perceptions of the world. So in the 19th century, as scientific tools evolved, so did the study of race. Scientists began to use anthropometrics. Knott and Glidden used skull angles to measure the distinctions between whites, blacks, and chimpanzees. And Samuel George Morton amassed over 1,000 skulls of Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans to test his hypothesis that larger brains meant higher intelligence. And his measurements, which later were shown to have a tremendous margin of error, always found Europeans more intelligent. So eventually it became clear that these anthropometric techniques were limited. Scientists, however, then had a new item in their toolkit, which was intelligence tests. And these tests purported to measure innate intelligence, even though there's no evidence of a connection between IQ scores and intelligence. And as with all racial measurements devised by Europeans, it was found that Europeans and European Americans were the most intelligent. And these intelligence tests were used in arguments in favor of eugenics. Madison Grant, for example, argued that Nordics were superior to all other races due to their high intelligence, and the idea of eugenics was also the basis for Hitler's eugenic sterilization law. So ideologies are often used to justify horrendous practices. In 1913, eugenicist Henry Goddard introduced the IQ test at Ellis Island, and his finding that new immigrants were not intelligent was used as the basis for exclusionary immigration laws. In the US, our first immigration laws were highly racialized. They excluded Asians and Southern and Eastern Europeans from entering the United States. Science was also used to exclude Asians from citizenship. In Takao Ozawa versus the United States, the court argued that Ozawa was not white because despite his white skin, anthropologically speaking, he was not a member of the Caucasian race. A few months later, in Bhagat Singh Thind, the court argued that although Thind may have some ancestral connections to the Caucasian race in the deep reaches of antiquity, his skin was not white. So whiteness was what the court said, with science used as a justification when convenient. Asians were denied citizenship, and 1.5 million Mexicans were deported, and all of this done based on ideas of European superiority. So here again, we see ideologies being put into practice with tremendous consequences. Then Japanese and Japanese Americans were interned during World War II, and African Americans were subjected to medical experimentation. During the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, Black men were diagnosed with syphilis, yet neither treated for it nor told that they had it. So ideas of white superiority justified Jim Crow. Between 1896 and 1954, it was legal to deny African Americans, American Indians, Mexicans, and Asians access to public schools and other facilities designed for whites. Today, however, we have eliminated laws that discriminate against non-whites. Presidents have signed civil rights acts and put affirmative action into place. And science today is on our side. In 1998, the American Anthropological Association issued a statement on race, concluding that contemporary science makes clear that human populations are not unambiguous, clearly demarcated, biologically distinct groups. So how do we explain the persistence of scientific racism today? The 1994 bell curve brought back the old argument that Europeans and now Asians have higher innate intelligence than African Americans. A 2004 book made similar claims. Richwine's 2009 dissertation argued that Hispanics are innately less intelligent than whites and should be denied entry to the United States. In 2014, New York Times journalist Nicholas Wade argued for race-based science and a troublesome inheritance. And these are not marginal texts. Charles Murray's most recent book, Human Diversity, The Biology of Gender, Race, and Class, was reviewed in the New York Times. And although lynching is illegal, recent events in Florida, Ferguson, Cleveland, and New York show us that to some people, Black lives do not matter. There's a plethora of data that show that non-whites are disadvantaged in the United States. Black men are 7 times as likely as white men to be incarcerated. Black women with more education are less likely to get jobs than white men. And perhaps the most precious fact of all, African Americans have on average 6 years less of life than do white Americans. So racial ideologies have shifted as scientific methods have shifted, but these ideologies have not gone away. In the 18th century, racial classification was used to justify genocide and slavery. In the 19th century, anthropometrics was used to justify a European-dominated society. In the 20th century, intelligence tests were used to justify the subordinate position of Black people and the exclusion of Asians and certain Europeans. And then in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, more refined intelligence tests and genomic sequencing are used to explain and justify white supremacy. There has been progress, but the ideologies that undergird racial disparities in this country persist. The ideologies have adjusted to the times, as have the pseudoscientific measures implemented to justify white supremacy. So racial discrimination is illegal. Racial discrimination is stigmatized. Nevertheless, racial inequality persists. In the nation's capital, Black unemployment is 6 times that of white unemployment. So how do we have racism when people of color are in positions of power in the United States? So Eduardo Bonilla Silva argues that we have racism without racists. So the prevalence of colorblind racism is the ideology of today, is that the idea that people can use non-racial language to reproduce racial inequality. And although our laws are race neutral, they still lead to racially disparate outcomes because of colorblind racism. So ideologies shift with time and circumstance. We no longer have white people enacting violence to prevent Black children from attending school with their children. But we do have white people who don't want their children to learn about this racist history. The power of ideologies lies in their power to change to fit the circumstances. So race is an ideology. The genealogy of the idea of race is important to disentangle to understand the work racial ideologies are doing today. Racist ideologies in the Americas are similar due to their shared genealogy. But what happens when race becomes too capacious? So let's think about some of the other definitions of race offered in this volume. In the Antiquity volume, Sarah DeBrue defines race as an outward-facing category that allows people to categorize and essentialize others. In the Medieval volume, Christine Chisholm says medieval race is not only or primarily rooted in phenotype. And then in the Renaissance and early modern age volume, Dorothy Kim argues that race is the tendency to demarcate human beings through difference that are selectively essentialized so as to distribute power differently to human groups. So the difference here is that with Dorothy Kim's definition, she then adds on that race is also used in relation to power very explicitly. But from my understanding, from the modern perspective, race is a group of people who share physical and cultural traits as well as a common ancestry, and race is an ideology linked to notions of white supremacy concretized during the colonization of the Americas, and that was used to justify these atrocities. And racism is both the belief that race exists and the practice of subordinating races. And for me, what I've done today is sort of trace this genealogy to show you how I've arrived at the definition of race that I use. So for me, it's super important when we talk about race to trace the genealogy of the idea of race. It's also important to understand racism as an ideology and a structure, and to ask, is what I'm talking about race, or is it ethnicity, nation, religion, culture, colorism, or is it something else? So some questions I have are what is the analytical purchase of using race to describe difference? And what is gained and what is lost when we use race to describe concepts that fall outside of the set of ideas European scientists developed to justify the enslavement of Africans and the genocide of Native Americans? The reason I ask these questions is because of the importance of genealogy. The modern idea of race crystallized during the Enlightenment. This idea did not, of course, emerge out of the blue. It had precursors, such as the treatment of the Irish by the English and the treatment of the Moors and Jewish people by the Spanish. The treatment of the Irish and the expulsion of the Moors also, of course, had precursors. So can we link these ideologies across time? This is what I mean by tracing the genealogy of the idea of race. Similarly, today, people sometimes use race to discuss the treatment of certain ethnic groups in Eastern or Western Asia today. What is the genealogy of those ideas? Are they linked in some ways to the ideas developed by Europeans to justify slavery and genocide? Or do they have their own genealogies? And if they have their own genealogies, then why do we use the term race? Using a capacious definition of race risks losing the specificity that allows us to understand that allows us to use race to understand the root of contemporary inequalities. And so why use a capacious definition of race when the English language is itself capacious and has so many other possibilities? Thank you. And I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you. Tanya, very much indeed. I particularly like the way you, with the rapacious of the English language conquer the universe linguistically, and I also like the fact that so much on inequality brought the center to this conversation, race to theories of social and inequality. And finally, I mentioned Dorothy she's with us now. And I should like my attention to invite to say a few words.
Hi. Is there an echo? Okay.
I don't think so.
Okay, I hear an echo. All right. These are actually just commentary then, since I've missed the first hour and a half since I was teaching class. But I know what Kim has written, so I'm just gonna kind of work off that, and actually just things that I've heard in the last little bit that I've entered into this conversation. I think, the visual rhetoric is really clear. Like, you can look at the screen and look at all of us. I mean, until I entered this room like 20 minutes ago or so, like, this was an incredibly white panel. How is it that we are doing a sort of longue durée cultural history of race and every editor is white except for me? And what happened in relationship to that and what is going on with that? I think in terms of the volume, just more generally, my interests were basically to make sure that first, I hate the title because it is 1350 to 1550, and the fact that we have to also use the term Renaissance is ridiculous. But I know this is basically set by the sort of cultural history series out of Bloomsbury, but it's deeply problematic in all these sorts of ways. And in relationship to the title and the temporality, I actually want to, and kind of in conversation with Tanya's presentation, I think actually a kind of longer conversation about the term and the use of race, right, which is not the same in every period or, location. I think we should actually go and have a look at Charles Mills's most recent work just before he died, and his really excellent article about the chronopolitics of racial time, where he actually takes this up and thinks about it as like, is it a short, medium, or longer history of race and the construction of sort of basically white supremacy, racial capitalism, and sort of what those genealogies actually mean. And I think, in the same way, I think at least in the volume that we edited, number 3, my main interest was in actually having this conversation where the actual chapter writers really thought through or had a dialogue with contemporary theory about these various discussions, whether this be, and I think this is interesting because so much, or at least the bits I've heard, has been about a conversation about scientific racism, right? But is this a conversation that also thinks about what, you know, I discussed in the intro, the sort of conversations about science and race that are happening, like Shay Akil McLean's excellent piece, The Isolation by Distance and the Problem of the 20th Century, the 21st Century, which actually takes up like genetics. And they point out that it is actually race is racism. So the sort of, you know, conversation about that, and the conversation, that piece is so excellent because it thinks through the temporality in relationship to the history of the Genome Project and the sort of imagined breakdown, which is about this sort of idea of a kind of, I don't know, like pure groups happening pre-1500, and that is the basis, right? So what the sort of conversation about the genetic now. But the rest of the sort of other sort of things that we discussed, the Troy Duster work, the Patricia Hill Collins work, there's like a very long conversation. And one of the things that I'm interested in the volume and thinking about is that I'm very clear that what we're talking about in terms of race and structural racism is biopolitical and sociocultural. So we're really pulling from the work of biopolitics, in particular the work of Black feminists in biopolitics. So Sylvia Wynter's work, you know, Catherine McKittrick's work, etc. And then the sociocultural. So we're thinking about, yes, the work happening out of the US and North America, and basically the discussion of racial formation in the United States. So Omi and Wynant's work, which is very important. But I think then they have already answered the question about why the terminology race is important to discuss post civil rights as opposed to, you know, the other term ethnicity. And I think with that in mind, the chapters that we have, the various writers have discussed, have really kind of more or less worked through more contemporary discussions of theory. And what I would discuss, I mean, I don't know if this is discussed because I missed the first like hour and a half, the conversations about race in relationship to the material turn-in theory. So, you know, Geraldine Heng does the definition article. So she's thinking about some of these questions because her work is based in a kind of genealogy theoretically about biopolitics and the sociocultural discussions of race. You have basically then the next chapter, which is Adamir Shira's work, which is talking about settler colonial studies and indigenous studies and race and environment. And then my race and religion chapter is actually thinking about the sort of discussion of the census in relationship to racial religious difference. And then the race and science chapter is actually a conversation about bioarchaeology. Matthew Vernon is very clear about his, in his chapter on race and politics, about his debt to biopolitics in particular, and the sort of material turn discussions in relationship to race, which is, you know, the sort of contemporary discussions happening in critical race studies. Kathleen Levezo kind of rethinks race and ethnicity in relationship to Anderson's work. And then Michelle and I, when we did race and gender, we were basically kind of discussing the fact that pre-modern, you know, the pre-modern archive and the scholarship never really wants to deal with the history of queer color critique and the history of intersectionality, because it also sort of tends to imagine that everyone was white. And then race and sexuality, that is a chapter where both Sturgis and McCoskey, but McCoskey in particular really thinks about transgender studies and the problem of whiteness in transgender studies. And then you have Asa Mittman's article about anti-race, which is really a conversation about, you know, anti-racism. So I'm just gonna leave it out there, but I do think there's we have to talk about the politics of what this panel looks like and what is going on with that and why a cultural history of race. Basically, you know, you've created a white panel until I showed up like 25 minutes ago. So what does that say now?
Well, it says that had we planned this, would not have turned out so well. So thank you, Dorothy, so much for coming in, offering, only provoking us, but also offering such a good overview. But we did speak about the fact that we all are white in this way at the beginning of this conversation, and Kim in particular raised this issue quite forcefully. So, but sadly, we only have 4 minutes left. So that would allow for a very concise and incisive conversation on a topic that deserves much more attention that it could be devoted to in the next 3 minutes. So, Rodri, would you like to pick up something from our participants to conclude this conversation or not?
Yes, well, thank you, Marius, and thanks to everyone that's contributed as speakers today and in the chat. I mean, I don't think, looking at the chat box that we have, that anyone's sort of asked a specific question. There's been a couple of interesting points, obviously, particularly with regards to the group of editors that we have. Just having something come up here so that I'm just, somebody's asked, since racism is used to justify inequality, can racism be ended without ending capitalism? Again, quite a big question, I suppose, with limited time, depending on if anyone would like to tackle that one.
No.
Tanya, would you like to say a few words?
Dorothy, do you
Yeah,
have,
I mean, I'll briefly just say it's a really huge question that we can't address in a short time. But I don't think we can, like, we don't have time in the 3 minutes remaining to explain how to end racism. I think the point of the panel is to show the long history of race, and I think one of the questions that I raised is, I'm not a historian by any stretch of the imagination. So I think there's also a question, because most historians do argue that racism and capitalism were born of the same historical moment and therefore must be disentangled simultaneously. But I think what that question does also is reinforce the political importance of, what do we mean about pre-capitalist racism or race? You know, what are we talking about? Because there are political implications when we kind of trace race back to antiquity or to pre-capitalist times. And I think that's a question that the historians need to address.
Dorothy, would you like to?
Why do we imagine that particular early modern conversation? I mean, I think this is the part where, you know, we gesture to some of the more recent work in bioarchaeology, but in fact, you know, maybe like an earlier rehearsal of transatlantic slavery and the sort of genealogies are happening earlier than the early modern period. So I think this is a sort of also, let's go back and have a look and reassess the archive question and what that means. And, you know, what are we discussing, that this is sort of something that comes out of nothing and just sort of burst onto the scene, or in fact that there were multiple sort of, you know, tendrils of rehearsals of this in sort of various locations at various times. I mean, we didn't discuss it in our volume, but I mean, I'm thinking of the recent work partly because he hasn't published it yet, but I've heard several talks of the history, the historian of sort of medieval Africa. So I don't remember if he discusses this specifically in his recent book, but this is sorry, this is what happens when you just basically taken class and then sort of lost your train of thought. But the book African Dominion, I don't know if he discusses this yet, and this is Michael Gomez's work, who is at NYU, but his recent work actually talks about the trans-Saharan slave trade and the conversations about the construction of race in the Islamic world that sort of feeds into the sort of larger conversations about the Black Atlantic. So I think this is like work that we are still in the process of doing. I don't remember if he actually gestures to this in African Dominion, but he has given at least a couple of talks about this. So I mean, I look forward to when this work is sort of published, and then we can have that discussion. So I think maybe that's the question. Why are we imagining this very specific beginning and like beginning, right? That it sort of came out of nowhere, right? That it didn't have a sort of longer sort of rehearsals in multiple locations.
Thank you. And just by way of suggesting a name here, perhaps the work of Paul Gilroy should be mentioned, because he's done some tremendous work and he's a scholar I greatly admire. I'm sure the conversation will continue, and it should continue, and the volumes will create some buzz in their respective fields, but more sort of holistically in terms of what can we do with this. And ultimately, from the way I see it, in the way I see it, I reckon ultimately we should be committed to an anti-racist scholarship, irrespective of how we define ourselves. And I think that's crucial, and we need to have this conversation and situate ourselves in the story. We are, whether we like it or not, in a moment of global reckoning. The pandemic, the war in Ukraine only accentuated these problems. And I think that scholarly engagement with anti-racism activism is critical. That's the way I want to end, in a way, to reiterate that we disagree for the sake of continuing to agree at some point in the future on some of the basic tenets of what anti-racist scholarship should be about. And I'm very grateful to Bloomsbury for organizing this. I'm very grateful to all of you for participating, and especially my thanks to Rhodri and to the editors for taking time from their teaching and from their personal commitments to join in and share with us some of their views. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Marius.